Tonight's presentation, Double Standard, ? Our presenter, Mike Bush. Mike is president of Savvy Aviation Incorporated. He's an author for numerous aviation publications, holds a certified flight instructor certificate, A&P mechanic certificate with inspection authorization, the 2008 Aviation Technician of the Year with the FAA, and a member of EAA. Mike, thank you so much for sharing this information with us tonight. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Tonight's webinar is going to be a little bit unusual. I want to get something off my chest that has been bothering me for the better part of 20 years. And I want to vent on about 400 of my best friends out there in the audience about this. And it has to do with some differences between the way pilots are treated and the way mechanics are treated. Now, I never really wanted to become an A&P mechanic. Actually, all I really wanted was the ability to swing wrenches on my own airplane. And if the FAA had offered something like a limited repairman certificate for certificated airplanes, I probably wouldn't be an A&P today. I probably would have been happy with that. But the FAA does not. If you want to swing wrenches on a certificated airplane and you don't want to have to do it under supervision, you pretty much have to go for an A&P. And the FAA doesn't make it particularly easy to do that. Just to give you an idea, it takes 40 hours of experience to earn a private pilot certificate. Most people take more like 50 hours, but that's the 40 hours is what the regulations require. 250 hours for a commercial, 1,500 hours for an A&P, for an ATP rather. But if you want to get an A&P certificate, you need to have 4,800 hours of experience before you're even allowed to take the test. And then I won't go into what the tests involve, but there's 3 written tests and an all-day practical test. It's a pretty grueling thing. But I went through it. And about 20 years ago, I earned my A&P certificate. And I had been a pilot for 35 years at that point. And now I was a fledgling A&P. And I found some of the things about my new A&P privileges to be rather surprising, given my background as a pilot. To maintain my pilot privileges, I have to undergo regular recurrent training and regular reevaluations. The FAA requires me and all other pilots to submit to a flight review every 2 years. I'm a CFI myself, but I have to get a flight review with another CFI. If I want to keep my instrument rating current, I have to go through an instrument proficiency check every 6 months. There's quite an investment in time and money to keep this currency, but I've never complained about it because I think it's essential for us to be safe pilots that we be periodically reevaluated and that we periodically take recurrent training to keep our knowledge current. But when I became a mechanic, I discovered that things were very different for mechanics. I was pretty shocked to find that the FARs provide for absolutely no requirement for a mechanic to get any sort of recurrent training, and no requirement that a mechanic his skills ever be reevaluated by anybody. For all intents and purposes, and there are a few slight exceptions to this that I'll get into, but for all intents and purposes, the FAA treats the mechanic certificate as if it's a license for life. Now, there is a requirement that to exercise the privileges of an A&P certificate that you need to have some recency of experience. You're supposed to have acted as a mechanic, or at least supervised mechanics or something like that, for at least 6 months out of the last 24 months. But that's a regulation that's almost never enforced. And I'll talk in a minute why that is. There is no requirement at all that a mechanic's work be scrutinized by anybody else, with a little exception that I'll talk about in a minute. But nothing like the flight reviews and instrument proficiency checks and check rides and stuff that pilots have to go through. And there's no requirement that a mechanic's knowledge ever be retested or kept up to date in any way. And in fact, there's an awful lot of stale knowledge in the mechanic community. This has seemed very wrong to me. You know, I've been a pilot a lot longer than I've been a mechanic. And it just didn't seem to me appropriate that there's such a double standard between the way pilots are treated and the way mechanics are treated with respect to recurrent training and recurrent reevaluation. And here's something else that I've found troubling. As a pilot, my privileges are strictly limited by the pilot certificates and ratings I hold. So for example, if I want to fly IFR, which I do a lot, I have to earn an instrument rating. If I want to fly a twin, which I do, or a helicopter or a glider, which sometimes I do, not a helicopter, but a glider, I'm required to earn appropriate category and class ratings to be able to do that. And if I wanted to fly a jet, which is a little bit above my pay grade, I would be required to earn a specific type rating for every make and model that I want to fly. That would also be true if I wanted to fly a large airplane over 12,500 pounds. By contrast, there's nothing like that for mechanics. As an A&P, the scope of my maintenance authority is virtually boundless. My A&P certificate allows me to swing wrenches on anything. J3 Cub, 747, a Huey helicopter, the Goodyear Blump. I don't know how Goodyear would feel about that, but there are really no limitations as to what kinds of aircraft an A&P is allowed to work on. Whether it's powered by turbines or recips made of wood or fabric, welded steel tube, monocoque, riveted aluminum, carbon fiber, airfoils that are fixed or rotating, as an A&P, I'm allowed to work on it. In fact, as an A&P, from a regulatory standpoint, there are only two things that I'm not allowed to do. I'm not allowed to do major repairs or alterations to propellers. For that, the propeller has to go to a FAA certified repair station, propeller repair station. And I'm not allowed to do any repairs or alterations to instruments. Those have to go to an FAA certified instrument repair station. But with those two exceptions of propellers and instruments, anything else is fair game for any A&P to perform work on and to approve the work on. Now, there are a couple of limitations to the very broad statements I've just made, and let me go through them. There's a regulation called 6581A that says if an A&P performs work that he's never performed before, he must be supervised by somebody who has performed the work before. This is a regulation that nobody ever pays any attention to and nobody ever enforces because nobody really knows what it means. For example, I own a Cessna 310. I've changed the tires on my Cessna 310 lots of times as an A&P. So may I change a tire on a Cessna 421 without supervision? Is that work I performed before or not? What about changing a tire on a J3 Cub or a Learjet or an Airbus? You can see the problem here. If that regulation were interpreted very narrowly, then nobody could ever work on anything without supervision. And if it was interpreted broadly, it basically is meaningless. And as far as I know, the FAA has never ruled on exactly what that regulation means, what work that you've never performed before, what that means. And so for all intents and purposes, as far as I can tell, nobody ever pays any attention to this rule. Mechanics wrench on whatever is presented to them. And then there's that regulation I mentioned before called 6583, recent experience requirement, which says an A&P may not exercise the privileges of his certificate unless he served as a mechanic or supervised other mechanics for at least 6 months during the preceding 24 months. But nobody really knows what that means either. And this regulation is generally ignored and seldom enforced because the FAA does not require mechanics to keep any records of the work they perform. You know, we pilots, we have to keep logbooks in order to do all sorts of things. But there's no requirement for mechanics to keep logbooks. Mechanics have to make maintenance record entries that they give to the aircraft owners for the aircraft they work on, but they aren't required to keep copies of any of those entries. And mechanics aren't required to keep any records of any of the work they work on. Am I the only one that thinks this is crazy? Why are the standards for mechanics and pilots so different? So, at any rate, call me crazy, but I think mechanics should have to earn type certificates to work on various kinds of airframes and engines, just as pilots have to do to fly them. And I think that mechanics should take regular recurrent training and undergo regular reevaluation of their knowledge and skills, just the way pilots have to do. Now, before everybody gets their knickers in a knot, let me mention that I am not proposing that the FAA regulate A&Ps more than they presently do. I'm not a big fan of FAA regulation. And the way I personally would like to see this problem addressed is by the GA industry itself. We as an industry, in my opinion, should be doing something to ensure the quality of the mechanics that are out there in the fleet by making sure that they do regular recurrent training, that their skills and knowledge are regularly reevaluated, and that they have something akin to type ratings for the various different kinds of work that they do. Earning an A&P should not be a global license to work on anything for the rest of your life, in my view. It isn't for pilots, and I don't think it should be for mechanics. And I know there are a lot of mechanics that don't agree with this, and there are probably some of them here who are listening to this webinar. So, I'm just expressing my opinion about this, and I know some of your mileage may vary. But as an example of what the kind of thing I would like to see in our industry to deal with this issue, take a look at the medical industry for a minute, as an example. You want to become a doctor, you go to college and go to medical school and you earn a degree. It's called a Doctor of Medicine or an MD. And that's great, but in today's world, having an MD doesn't let you do very much. Back in the early days of medicine, that was the case. But back in 1937, a group of surgeons got together because they were a little bit concerned that a lot of guys that had their MD were performing surgery and weren't really qualified to do it, even though they'd earned an MD. So they created something called the American Board of Surgery. This isn't a governmental agency or anything. This is just something run by doctors for doctors. And so nowadays, if you want to be a surgeon, not only do you have to have an MD, but you've got to be board certified with the American Board of Surgery. And they require you to go through testing and evaluation for your surgical skills. In something that I think is vaguely similar to a category and class rating for a pilot. This is a surgery rating, if you will, for a doctor. But nowadays, even being a board certified surgeon isn't enough because there are so many subspecialties. There's board certification in orthopedic surgery and plastic surgery and ophthalmic surgery, a whole million different subspecialties of surgery. And these things I would suggest are vaguely similar to type ratings for pilots. But wait, there's more. If you take a close look at this certificate from the American Board of Plastic Surgery, this board certification for this particular doctor, you'll see it's got an expiration date. It's good for 10 years. So effectively, the American Board of Plastic Surgery and basically all of the surgical certification boards have implemented since 1974. Again, it used to be when you're board certified, it was a board certification for life. But since 1974, they changed that. And surgeons require what I will call a decennial flight review. Every 10 years, they have to reestablish their board certification. They have to go through recurrent testing. Now, that's a pretty long time, 10 years. And in fact, the American Board of Surgery thought it was too long a time too. So a few years ago, they introduced a new thing that they are calling the continuous certification program. They haven't made it mandatory yet. Surgeons are still allowed to renew their board certification once every 10 years. But they're encouraging surgeons to use this new program, and they're giving them lots of incentives to do it. The new program is something that can be done online rather than going in for a proctored exam. It's something that's open book. They actually did a pretty interesting job with it. But effectively, they're requiring recertification of surgeons under this new program every 2 years. So it's a biennial flight review program. And presently, it's voluntary. The surgeon can decide whether he wants to recertify under the new system every 2 years or under the old system every 10 years. But the new system is a lot more painless, and that's intentional. And I would guess that eventually the old system will be retired, and all surgeons will have to go through this biennial flight review. Let's take a look at something at another industry. We've just looked at medicine and how they've dealt with things. Let's look at the automotive service industry. Now, the automotive service industry is interesting. There's really no degree required to work on cars. You don't go get a doctor of mechanics in order to work on cars. There is no such thing. But back in 1972. The automotive industry itself created a nonprofit entity called the National Institute for Automotive Service Excellence. They actually did this as sort of as I understand it, as sort of a defensive measure because there were so many problems with car mechanics that the federal government was threatening to start regulating car mechanics, and nobody wanted that. So the industry got together and said, hey, let's regulate ourselves so that the government doesn't have to regulate us, which actually seems like a pretty smart move. At any rate, ASE is an independent organization that is dedicated to improving the quality of automotive service and repair through voluntary, and that's just important, voluntary testing and certification of automotive professionals. And that's the kind of thing that I would like to see in the aviation industry for mechanics, voluntary testing and certification of mechanics. There are about 250,000 mechanics now, mechanics and collision repair technicians, parts specialists that are ASE certified professionals now. And the certifications come in lots of levels and lots of subspecialties, and they have little badges. And a lot of shops like to advertise that they employ only ASE certified professionals, and they hang big signs up and so on as so that their customers know that they're hiring really qualified mechanics. Tremendous number of different levels of testing and certification that ASE offers in the automotive world. Here's a handful of some of the tests and certifications that they do, and there are a lot more than this. Interestingly, ASE certifications are valid for 5 years. It's not the 10 years for surgeons, and it's not the 2 years for pilots, or the new thing for surgeons. It's kind of in the middle. It's a 5-year certification. And at the end of 5 years, if you want to keep your ASE certification as a car mechanic, you have to go back and recertify. The recertification tests are not as grueling as the initial tests. The initial tests are proctored exams that are taken in testing centers. The recertification is something that can be done online, and it takes about half as long as the initial certification. But for a mechanic to retain each of his different ASE certifications, he has to be retested every 5 years. So, at any rate, it seems to me, if this sort of thing, if this sort of industry organized voluntary program for recurrent training and recurrent recertification works for doctors, works for car mechanics, why wouldn't it work for A&Ps? So this is an idea that I and some colleagues of mine are going to be pursuing. I know there are a lot of mechanics that think everything's just fine the way it is right now, and they don't need no stinking recertifications. And that's exactly what car mechanics thought in 1972 when ASE got launched. But now everybody pretty much accepts it. The program is very, very well established, very well organized. And I would really like to see something like that for aircraft mechanics, so that aircraft owners know the qualifications of people they're dealing with, the mechanics that they're dealing with, and know that their knowledge is up to date and has been reevaluated on a periodic basis. And Tim, that's all the preaching I have to do. The sermon is over, and we can open it up for song or dance or whatever you'd like to do now.
Comments. Got some comments here.
Comments. Okay, yeah. I bet there are.
Yeah. Ken's got a good question, though. Ken's wondering, what do other countries do in this area?
Well, I'm not an authority on that. I'm familiar with a couple of other countries, for example, the UK and Australia. Mechanics in those countries are much more regulated by their civil aviation authorities than they are in the U.S. But most of the other countries have the sort of thing that I was referring to as type ratings, where to work on various sort of categories of things, mechanics have to go get special ratings. It's not just airframe and power plant. There's a whole bunch of different ratings. My experience, for example, in Australia, is that the CASA, which is the CAA for Australia, it seemed to me had taken things a little bit too far. And that basically, if you want to bring your Bonanza in for an annual, you'd wind up having to get 5 different people signing off on the annual, an electronics guy and an airframe guy and a power plant guy. And I think that's going a bit too far. And that's one of the reasons that I'm not too keen on this problem being addressed in this country by the FAA. I would much rather see it be addressed by industry, because I think if it's addressed by industry, it will wind up being a much more reasonable solution. But the FAA works very slowly, and they tend to overkill problems a lot. And so my preference would be to see that industry deal with this rather than have the FAA do it. Very similar to what happened in the automotive service area, where in order to make sure that government didn't get into the act, the industry decided to do this for themselves. That's what I would like to see.
Robert wonders, what bad has happened that makes you think this is needed now? Oh,
goodness. Do we have an hour? Let me just say, I for the last 11 years, I've run a company that manages maintenance of pretty close to 1,000 GA aircraft all over the country and in a few other countries, but mostly in the United States. Dealt with hundreds and hundreds of different maintenance shops and many, many hundreds of mechanics around the country, and probably thousands of mechanics really around the country. And all I can say is that in my view, the level of incompetence in the general aviation maintenance infrastructure is absolutely breathtaking. To me, it's a scandal. And I really think it needs to be cleaned up. I could give you a ton of war stories about incompetence and accidents that have happened due to incompetence and stuff, but I won't. Let me just say, I'm in an interesting position to view this because I deal with so many different mechanics and so many different shops, and it is, trust me, it's a huge problem in the industry. At least that's my opinion.
Paul says you should work with the Aviation Technician Education Council, ATEC. It was on the board for the Part 147 NPRM. They could help.
Well, maybe so. I know there have been a couple of attempts to get something like this off the ground, and as far as I can tell, none of them have been successful. None of them have gotten anywhere close to critical mass. And that's one of the reasons that we're so interested in looking at what ASE has done in the automotive world, because they did manage to get to critical mass. They got the support of all the major automakers and stuff, and that really put them on the map. So it's not going to be easy to accomplish what I'm suggesting, and it may never happen. But in my view, it's worth trying to do. Because I think it's an important problem and it needs to be solved, and it has been solved in other industries that are, similar to aviation maintenance, and so I think it's at least possible. We have some feasibility, some existence proofs that such a thing can be successful. And whether we can make it successful at aviation, I don't know.
Mike's wondering, don't aircraft manufacturers have their own certifications?
Absolutely not. Well, I'll take that back. For a shop to become a certified service center, let's say for Cirrus or for Textron, they do require some type specific training. But it's typically much more limited than what we're talking about, and it typically doesn't have an expiration date on it. And there really isn't any oversight by the manufacturers. I know, for example, in the case of Cirrus, which I followed very, very closely because my company manages a whole lot of Cirruses, it's very, very rare for Cirrus to fire a Cirrus authorized service center. There has to be some incredible act of neglect, flagrant neglect, for that to happen. It's only happened very, very rarely. And there's a lot of bad work being done on Cirruses. I can tell you, I deal with it every single day.
And Paul, just kind of wondering, don't type clubs offer mechanic recurrent training on a particular aircraft or equipment on that aircraft?
Again, there's been some very limited stuff. The Cessna Pilots Association, for example, at one time, I'm not sure it still is true, but at one time offered classes on Cessna-specific classes on rigging airplanes for mechanics, but there's not very much of that at all. I'm not really aware of the next biggest type club I can think of is American Bonanza Society. I'm not really aware that they offer anything for mechanics. I'm pretty sure that that COPA, the Cirrus type club, which is probably the third largest type club. I don't think they really offer anything for mechanics. They offer a lot of stuff for pilots. And, and that's appropriate because, we all know that 80% of the accidents are caused by pilots. But the problem of incompetent mechanics really isn't being dealt with very well, in my view.
Paul says that he has to renew his Rotax ratings every 2 years to remain factory authorized.
Yeah, Rotax is interesting. Rotax has taken a particularly aggressive stance. There's not very much about Rotax I don't think is good. They make really good engines and they have a very enlightened approach. But, Continental and Lycoming have nothing like that at all. Rotax is really an outlier here and good for them.
Jerry's wondering, do airline A&P employees have skill and currency requirements to work for them? Would your suggestion work with their programs?
That's a question I'm really not in a good position to answer because it's outside of what I do. There aren't any requirements imposed by the FAA in any of the areas that we're talking about for airline mechanics. But there may very well be some programs that the airlines themselves operate, and I'm not knowledgeable in that area, so I can't really comment.
Robert's wondering, does the insurance industry do anything to evaluate skills, quality, and reliability of work when rating AMPs and IAs for premiums?
They do not, and that's one of the things that has always amazed me. When I bought my twin back in 1987, I discovered that in order for me to get insurance on it, I had to go through annual recurrent simulator training, which is a lot more than what the FAA required, but the insurance company required. And I think that's perfectly appropriate. And it's always astonished me that the companies that insure maintenance shops don't ever do anything like that. And the insurance industry could, if they wanted to, play an important role here in upgrading the quality of maintenance. But as far as I can see, they just aren't doing it. And I've never really had a good explanation as to why.
Ross is wondering, what about the IA AMT training that is done yearly?
Well, and that's true. For if you have an inspection authorization, you do need to typically go through an 8-hour recurrency course, which nowadays most of us do it online, and you need to do 8 hours of recurrent training a year to hold an IA. Most of the IA training is in IA kind of stuff. I mean, if you think about it, IAs are not in the business of fixing airplanes. That's what A&Ps do. IAs are in the business of inspecting airplanes and making airworthiness determinations. So the IA training is pretty much focused on inspection and airworthiness regulations and so on, and really doesn't focus very much on how you fix stuff, because that's not what IAs do. Now, of course, every IA is an A&P, but when we wear our A&P hat, we have no recurrent training or testing requirement. When we wear our IA hat, we do have an annual recurrent training requirement, but it's focused on the inspection part of the job, not on the fixing airplanes part of the job.
A couple of comments here from Donald about the American Bonanza Society. It says they definitely do have an education for mechanics program and an ongoing maintenance academy.
Well, interesting. I need to find out about that, because I've been aware of a lot of their programs. I actually used to write for the ABS magazine. I have applauded their service clinic program for a long time, but I was not aware that ABS did any mechanic training. So I will take that as a homework assignment to try to learn about that.
Jerry just wanted to.
Somebody wants to email me a URL to start, I would appreciate it.
Jerry just says the United States Parachute Association is the oversight and supervision of the parachuting industry. There are only 2 FARs that pertain to parachuting. USPA does a great job of licensing and training.
Yeah, and again, I'm not familiar with that, of course, because that's kind of out of my wheelhouse. But I'm a big fan of the industries regulating themselves as opposed to having government do it. I think the industry can move a lot faster, be a lot more responsive. The wheels turn very slowly at the FAA. So, as I said, I'm not proposing that the FAA change any regulations here. What I'm proposing is that the maintenance industry, and particularly the aircraft maintenance industry, but particularly the general aviation aircraft maintenance industry, which is the part I care about, and it's kind of the Wild West of aviation, because GA mechanics have the least guidance, the least structure. It's very, very different being a GA mechanic than working for the airlines. It's kind of totally different environment. And I just can tell you from firsthand experience that we need help in this area. And I think that mechanics really ought to, or the GA industry in general ought to get together and deal with this problem.
Several people have chimed in about the airlines and FAA certificated repair stations having training program requirements and more tighter requirements. And your comment there just suggested to me that you're not talking about that area. You're talking about strictly just general aviation.
Well, it's true that that Part 145 repair stations, FAA certified repair stations, have a good deal more oversight, and there is now in Part 145 some requirements for both initial and recurrent training of mechanics that work in Part 145 repair stations. Having said that, the vast majority of the maintenance that are done on small airplanes are not done in Part 145 repair stations. If you're flying a Citation, it's probably going to be maintained in Part 145 repair station. But if you're flying a Bonanza, the likelihood is that the shop you use is not Part 145 and really gets very, very little FAA oversight.
So Wendy's comment, do you really think that incompetence or dishonesty can be cured by a couple of online classes?
Okay, well, first of all, I'm not talking about dishonesty here. That was not anything I brought up, and with the very few exceptions, the mechanics that I encounter are honest people. I don't feel that in general they're motivated by greed or anything like that. So let's take that off the table. But I certainly do think that something along the lines of what ASE has done in the automotive world would be a big plus in general aviation maintenance arena. And I do think maybe we have some things to learn from physicians too. In practice, the ASE automotive program is more voluntary than the board certification program is in medicine. And the reason for that, and it's not a regulatory reason, it's simply that, if you're a surgeon and you're not board certified, you don't get hospital privileges. So for all intents and purposes, you can't be a surgeon without being board certified. There's no regulation that says that. It's just that the industry has taken that as its standard. In the automotive industry, it's not quite that strong. Not every shop hires only ASE certified mechanics. Some do, some don't. It's a much more voluntary thing. But at least the motorists who are using these shops know if the shops are hiring ASE certified mechanics, and they know what the ratings of those mechanics are. It's all very visible, and there's a strong incentive for shops and mechanics to do this. There's not a requirement. It's not the government that's legislating it, but there's a strong incentive. In medicine, there's an even stronger incentive, and I don't know exactly where the right balance ought to be with regard to A&Ps, but we've got two interesting models to look at that could serve as guidance for how this could be done.
Mike says if A&P should someday be required to get additional certification and training, both of which will require additional time and cost placed on the mechanics, would you be willing to accept a rise in maintenance costs that will more than likely be the result of additional certification requirements?
Okay, well, I'm going to say something very controversial here, but it's from the heart. I think that if mechanics were properly trained, maintenance costs would go down. Their hourly rate might go up, but one of the scourges of GA maintenance is that our airplanes are grossly over-maintained, and mechanics do things way beyond what is required. And I've written 3 books on this subject. We shouldn't be overhauling engines just because they got to TBO. We shouldn't be doing all sorts of things on timetables. And if mechanics were properly trained in reliability-centered maintenance, our maintenance costs would go drastically down. I mean, that's why I started my company, was to try to deal with some of these issues, and we do a really good job for our clients in this regard. The hourly rate that mechanics charge is probably the least important component of maintenance cost. The most important component is what maintenance is done and what maintenance isn't done. And that's the area where I think most mechanics don't have a clue, and need a lot more training. So I think if we had a really good industry mechanic training program that embraced some of these 21st century maintenance principles, the cost of maintenance would drop significantly, even if hourly rates went up. And by the way, hourly rates in GA maintenance are ridiculously low. I mean, there's no excuse for the fact that an A&P gets paid a lot less than a car mechanic. It just doesn't make sense.
John is wondering.
Don't get me started.
I think we already have.
Yeah, I think so.
John is wondering, you mentioned a limited repairman certificate for owner-owned aircraft. Do you know if this is under consideration by the FAA?
It is absolutely not under consideration, and as far as I can tell, it will never be under consideration. Canada actually did something kind of along those lines. If you have a certified airplane that's old enough to be considered, I don't know whether they call it antique or whatever, I think in Canada it's actually possible to get something akin to a repairman certificate that allows the owner to work on it. The airplane has to be obviously a non-commercial operation and so on and so forth. But I've been talking to people in the FAA about this sort of thing for years, and there's absolutely zero resonance. I don't expect it to ever happen in the FAA.
Wendy wonders, do ASE mechanics perform higher quality work than non-ASE mechanics? How is the performance difference, if any, measured?
Well, it's a good question. I knowing ASE, I bet you they have done a lot of studies on that. I don't have the information at my fingertips, but I bet it exists, because they're a very serious organization, and from what I can tell, they're doing just about everything right.
Thomas wonders, why are we rocking the boat and wanting to add regulations? Oh my.
I don't want to add regulations, and that's exactly the response I get from every A&P who listens to my spiel. I'm not suggesting that we add regulations. Absolutely not. I'm suggesting that we do a better job of policing ourselves.
A question that occurs to me, I'm going to ask you, it's my own question, but you said 4,800 hours to get an A&P certificate. Under your idea of what it could be, would that mean that the initial certificate would be less time, and then the ratings to do the specialized work would be some additional amount of time?
Again, I'm not proposing that there be any change in the FAA regulations, and the only reason I'm proposing that, I think there should be massive changes in the regulations, to be honest with you. But I spent 1.5 years of my life working on the FAA's Aeronautical Rulemaking Advisory Committee, trying to get the FAA to make some changes. And after 18 months, I sort of gave up because, as far as I can tell, there's really no appetite to make any changes. So that's another reason why I'm suggesting that we not look to a regulatory solution for any of this stuff. If I were FAA administrator for a week, there'd be a lot of changes to the maintenance regulations, but that's not going to happen. Don't anybody worry about it. And as far as I can tell, there's really no desire to make changes. The last time the FAA tried to make a major change in this area, it was a total fiasco. They issued a massive NPRM. They got a record number of negative comments. They withdrew it, and they probably aren't going to touch it again for a long, long time.
Gustavo is wondering, do you think it should be brought, this matter, to the ICAO?
No, I'm looking specifically at the U.S. problem. ICAO does not seem to be a very strong organization for getting stuff done. And again, if ICAO was involved, and if anything came out of it, it would probably be a regulatory solution, and that's really not what I'm suggesting here.
Ross wonders, have you tried to create a standard body for this, or worked with a standardized body to create standards?
Well, the answer is no. And right now, I and some colleagues of mine are kind of studying the problem. We're talking to ASC to try to see if either they're interested in possibly getting involved in the aviation world, which I kind of doubt that they will, or whether they're interested in mentoring an aviation group, because they've been doing this since 1972 and they've really got it pretty well down to a science. But I don't think any of this is going to happen unless there's a pretty broad industry support for it. So we're also going to have to be talking to the aircraft manufacturers and the engine manufacturers and trying to get them on board with some sort of a concert, a program to kind of raise the bar with respect to maintenance of their products.
Harley's wondering, have you gotten any feedback concerning your ideas from any of the aircraft manufacturers?
Yeah, it's very early. I'm in this webinar, I'm kind of just running this thing up the flagpole and hoping to get some feedback, and I'm sure I will. But it's very early in the process.
Ray says, I am an A&P and fully agree. Very few are capable of doing any avionics troubleshooting, and many provide incorrect engine operation tips with respect to Lena PCOPs.
Yes, that's true. And for Ray, for your benefit, when I was serving on ARAC, one of the big things that I was trying to achieve with a notable lack of success is to convince the FAA that mechanics needed much stronger training in the whole area of troubleshooting. My experience with A&Ps is that as a group, they're a whole lot better at therapy than they are at diagnosing things. In medicine, diagnosis are subspecialties. People specialize in it. That's kind of a type rating I'd almost like to see for mechanics is a diagnostician. ASE has courses in diagnosis, but the troubleshooting skills are not really very well taught in A&P school, and mechanics seem to be particularly weak. And again, I'm not trying to paint all A&Ps with one broad brush. There are obviously some outstanding troubleshooters out there in the A&P community, but they seem to be kind of few and far between. That's an area where mechanics seem to be quite weak. Another area that mechanics seem to be quite weak, and this is kind of close to what you were talking about, is anything that has electrons in it. The electricity seems to be a pretty weak spot among most A&P mechanics. And our airplanes are getting more and more electronic every day. And so it's an increasing problem. And the line between airframe and avionics has gotten so blurred now that you can't even figure out where it is anymore. So for somebody to have an airframe rating and not really be comfortable with avionics is a real big problem.
Hal just says, wouldn't it be great if they had to take a recurrent module on experimental aircraft?
Well, yeah, I'd go for that. I'd go for that. Again, if we did this as an industry, we could come up with these specialty areas, much as the way ASE has. They've got dozens and dozens of them now. Whereas for the FAA, it takes 10 years to get anything done. If it's a regulation thing, it takes 10 years, just almost guaranteed. I don't know why it takes so long, but that's the way it is.
Charles wondering, why wouldn't a large FBO company with maintenance not want certified shops, savvy certified shops?
Well, now let's not talk about savvy certified shops. I'm not proposing to do this under the savvy banner. This is something that would really need to have the support of industry and would need to be a nonprofit, I think. So I'm not trying to expand the reach of my company here. This is just Mike talking.
Well, Francisco, I don't know if he agrees with you, because he says apparently to get your A&P, you'll need a PhD.
Well, sometimes I think the PhD would be easier to get. But...
So Joe says, I think there should be a type rating for radial engines. Most today have no clue.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you start to make a list, you're going to come up with a long list of things there ought to be type ratings for, type ratings in quotes and air quotes. There are just so many subspecialties. I know when I was taking my A&P exam, one of the things I was required to do is demonstrate my ability to weld. And I quickly determined that I would never, ever, ever weld on a real airplane so long as I live. That's definitely a subspecialty. And yet, any A&P is allowed to weld, and most A&Ps wouldn't have a clue as to how. And there are just so many subspecialty areas that you can think of if you were trying to make a list.
Yeah. Harold's wondering, so who do you recommend be the quote unquote ASE equivalent to regulate or attempt to regulate training and currency for A&Ps?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, and there are a number of different approaches, but I personally think that the most likely candidate would be some sort of a nonprofit foundation that was backed by industry, maybe even that was provided seed money by industry, the Textrons and the Cirruses and the Continentals and Lycomings and so on and so forth, to raise the bar in the whole general aviation maintenance world. I think it's got to be an independent, nonprofit foundation, very much like ASE is. I think that's probably the right container for it.
Well, Mike, we have a lot more comments here that have come in that I think you'll find interesting reading in the follow-up report that I send you.
Okay, I bet you do.
Feedback from everybody, but I think that pretty much wraps up the questions. So I'd like to put an end to it here and give you.
My purpose in this was to just get the juices flowing and people thinking about it. And I know a lot of people probably aren't going to agree with me, but I thought it would be an interesting way to start a conversation.
That it was. And please take a moment, share your closing thoughts.
Okay, well, not too many closing thoughts that except that I've already said. My 3 books are now available on Amazon. The 4th book, which I think is my final work of nonfiction, is planned for Christmas time, and then I plan to write the great American novel. I put out a monthly free email newsletter, which you can sign up for by either going to savvyaviation.com and clicking on the sign up for the newsletter button, or during the post-webinar survey that Tim is going to send out. You can check a checkbox if you want to be added to the mailing list for the newsletter. And next 3 first Wednesday of the month webinars that I will be doing, sandwich in with a lot of webinars that other people will be doing in the EAA series. In October, I'll be talking about the FAA safety continuum, which is sort of a fancy word for the way the FAA has deals with the different levels of safety required for different kinds of aircraft. And I'll be focusing on the part of the safety continuum that affects maintenance, and how the maintenance regulations are different for various kinds of aircraft and various different uses of aircraft. The maintenance area is not very well understood by owners, by mechanics, even by some FAA safety inspectors. So we'll be going through how that works. November, the webinar is called "What is Preventive Maintenance?" And we all kind of know that preventive maintenance is the stuff that the FAA allows aircraft owners to do to their own airplanes without having an A&P or without having any supervision. But the question is exactly what are you allowed to do? And it turns out that you are allowed to do a whole lot more than most people think. So we'll be going through how that works and what kinds of things you're allowed to do to your airplane if you're not a mechanic, if you're not a certificated mechanic. And in December, I'm going to do a webinar called "Is Hangering Worth It?" This is prompted by the fact that earlier this week I got booted out of my hangar at Santa Maria Airport for 18 days while they're doing a repaving project, and I was forced to put my airplane outdoors, and it got me thinking about the whole question of the difference between hangering and tying down. And so I thought I would do a presentation on that in December, when it's, I guess December is a particularly good time to have a hangar in a lot of places. We don't get snow here in California, but some places. Tim, I bet you want to be in a hangar in December.
Oh, you bet. Yeah, it's definitely worth it up here in Wisconsin.
So, well, that's all I have, Tim. And I thank everybody for coming and joining the discussion. And I bet I'm going to get a bunch of emails, and that's great. Looking forward to it.
Hey, Mike, thanks a lot for the information tonight and sharing your opinion on this very interesting, thought-provoking, conversation stimulating topic.
Well, great.
To all the folks who tuned in tonight, thank you all so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Hope you can join us next week.
Thanks a million, everybody. See you next month.